Alex Waddock, you wanted to comment?
Yes,
and then Natasha.
I think this is very important, but it's looking at politics very much as if it's an event, and it's not an event, it's a process, and policy making is a process. And I think we have to have a longer-term perspective when we're looking at the policy-making process rather than on the very important day-to-day events that happen. And I think it's important to also go back to the years when Gough Whitlam was leader of the opposition. And he was a very energetic leader of the opposition and very active in the policy-making process. And it's important to recognise it was, in those days, still a participatory phenomenon. Members of his party were able to be involved in that process. And then when Whitlam came to be Prime Minister and form his cabinet, he had a suite of policies that had been thought through very carefully, and a lot of work had gone into it. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen at all these days, it still does, but I think that that kind of idea that the time in opposition is to prepare for government and to prepare policies and think it through very carefully, that's really been pushed away a little bit. And I think we lose a lot from that. I mean, governments really should, when parties come into government, they really should have a pretty good idea of a swag of ideas that they want to implement. And I think we've lost that a little bit.
Natasha, stop display.
Look, I think Alex is right to pick up on that other dimension, which is that public dimension too. Peter is spot on. Of course, there's got to be an element of trust between the Minister or the Prime Minister of the day and their public service members, and particularly people working closely with them. But don't forget the public in this equation, and the fact that obviously there has to be that sense of independence and accountability and transparency. And I think there are issues like security of tenure for, departmental heads or secretaries of departments, etc., to ensure that there is no place for partisan politics in the bureaucracy. It is one fundamental tenet, of course, of democracy, that we have a frank and fearless and strong and independent public service. And I think that there have been government reforms that bring that into question. And as I say, it's not necessarily suggesting public servants are failing to be responsive, but in fact that they'll want to be responsive to the government of the day, because the government of the day and the Prime Minister and the Minister has a very strong influence on either that person's tenure or appointment or future career.
And I think the answer to that is the concept of the public interest. I mean, a lot of politicians and a lot of public servants and a lot of ministerial advisors forget that they actually are in a position of public trust. And indeed, legally speaking, they are obliged to act in the public interest. Politicians get reminded of this from time to time when we have commissions of inquiry, and they get hauled up and they said, well, I didn't really realise that, as do public servants and ministerial advisors. And I think the way to get accountability in this area is not to get too hung up on the processes by which departmental heads are chosen, although I believe in a middle ground where the government of the day should be advised by an independent process but have the ultimate decision about who would be a head of a department. We shouldn't get too hung up about those issues, but we should have a strong code of conduct underpinning the work of ministerial officers. And of course, codes of conduct can be used in the assessment and judgment of ethical behaviour in those offices. There ought to be a very, very clear set of accountabilities that if ministerial officers cross the line, start directing public servants improperly, start doing things that are clearly against the public interest, that they will be held to account. Now, how do you do that? I think the sort of accountability we need there, I think, comes through the Parliament, and obviously in the national case we have the Senate, where the government of the day doesn't normally have the numbers, although the executive for a period of time prevented ministerial officers from appearing before inquiries, which I think was quite wrong. We have corruption commissions in Western Australia, Queensland and in New South Wales. We don't have corruption commissions at the national level, which I think is a real weakness of Australian government. Our national government does not have a corruption commission. And I think that's a very serious weakness in our system. So the accountability, I think, should come through those processes rather than formalistic changes in terms of the way we appoint our departmental heads.
I should point out that neither does South Australia or Victoria have corruption commissions, and both are very much debated and called for. Natasha Stott-Despoja.
Let's not forget, of course, public servants, and particularly at the Commonwealth level, are accountable. They're held accountable under the Public Service Act. The difference is, of course, that the advisors to which we refer are not subject to an act of that kind, not even the Ministerial and Parliamentary Services Acts. And indeed, Jeff, you're right. Code of conduct.
There is a code.
There is a code, but the problem with codes are, like any self-regulatory codes, for example, they've got to be enforceable. They've got to be policed. There's got to be disciplinary measures. And that means from ministers through to ministerial advisors and also for members of Parliament. So you've got to have some kind of independent commissioner who will ensure that disciplinary measures are provided. It's not good enough to have codes that are policed by a minister or even the Prime Minister, because that still represents a conflict of interest. So it's got to be truly independent and it's got to be enforced.
Alex Waddock.
Yes, I think it's important also to compare us with the United States system of government, and the US Constitution puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of checks and balances in their system, and they do have a lot of checks and balances in their system, but the checks and balances seem to often prevent them from doing good things but don't stop them from doing bad things. So right now the checks and balances are stopping the Obama administration from further financial stimulus, and that's clearly needed, and it didn't stop them with all the terrible things that happened during the Bush era, including the torture and the wars and the tax cuts and so forth. In our situation, I think we're lucky to have a question time. I wish we could devise some better rules so the question time wouldn't be abused by both sides, as it clearly is.
Well, if I can intervene, there are better rules in the Senate than in the lower house, in the House of Reps, because answer time is limited. You can't have the Prime Minister answer a question for 20 minutes, for example, as you can in the House of Reps.
The quality really shows, doesn't it?
Sorry, Alex, I interrupted you.
Yes, so I think let's have more checks and balances, and let's try and get better use of question time at the Commonwealth and state level.
And let's not forget that the Senate at the Commonwealth level is absolutely crucial in holding public servants to account, much more than the House of Representatives. And we're right, public servants are held to account, both under their legislation and through an ombudsman and through an auditor general. But they're held to account in a particular way, which is often forgotten, because you think public servants serve the public. Well, they do, but in a sort of odd way. I mean, they are accountable to Parliament through their minister, is usually the way that it's formulated. Having said that, I think this is an area we need to make progress on, because Natasha is right. I am a very strong supporter of the system of governance we've got, where professional public servants serve successive governments with equal commitment. But I do think that both at the Commonwealth and state levels, public servants also have to understand their role to the broader community. And indeed, my view is public services need to be made over, need to have a much greater role in facilitating the voice, particularly of community organisations, actually not trying to hoard power and keep the ear of the Minister or the Prime Minister to themselves, but actually open up the range of organisations that can actually influence policy. And the reason I think it's so important is that governments at all levels are actually increasing outsourcing the delivery of their services and programs, both to the private sector but increasingly to the community sector. Now, in that situation, the role of the public servant has got to change, and I think that's one of the great reforms that has to take place over the next decade.
Peter, I think it's also curious that while we've had this discussion for quite a few minutes now, we haven't really, for something that is being prepared for the media, talked about the media at all. And the media have got an incredibly important role in the quality of government that countries obtain. And we don't do so well on that score, in the sense that we've got the highest concentration of media newsprint ownership in the world. And that's, I think, a problem that we haven't really faced properly. Secondly, we have got, like every other country in the world, we're faced with a situation where the kind of discussion that goes on in the quality broadsheets has a huge impact on the debates that go on in the country and that will in fact influence the public service and the politicians and the community's views generally. And yet we're starting an era where the quality broadsheets are in big trouble, as is the rest of the print media. And we have to really start thinking about how the major dilemmas that face our country in education and health and economics and across the board, how we are going to engage in those kinds of debates as quality newsprint starts disappearing.
Well,
and it's disappearing at a great rate in the United States.
I could say something about the importance of a national public broadcaster, but I'll refrain from doing that.
If you didn't, I would.
And Peter Shergold, I wanted to pick up on something that you raised, and this is, you talked about the public service changing and opening up and ideas coming through and so on. But there's also questions about the relationship between you raised earlier, the relationship between public servants and ministers. So, for example, at the moment we see a very close relationship between the head of Treasury, Ken Henry, arguably now the most powerful public servant in the country, and the Prime Minister. Some people argue that the Prime Minister and Treasurer are using Ken Henry as a shield. Get Ken Henry's endorsement for your policy and it's a big tick. Now, is there a risk of senior public servants becoming too close to their ministers?
My personal view is yes. I believe you must have a relationship of trust with your minister, but my personal view is that that doesn't extend to friendship. And what I mean by that is that it is all very important always, in my view, to have a relationship which says there will come occasions when I'm going to have to give you advice you really will not wish to hear, or on occasions where I will have to say no. So for that reason, I always had a policy, this is me, of never being on first-name terms with my minister or Prime Minister. I always referred to them privately as well as publicly as minister. They would call me by my first name. But it was to say that although I wanted, and I think always did, have a very close working relationship, there was a barrier which meant it wasn't the same as friendship. That you couldn't expect that we would necessarily share the same political views. That wasn't my role, and if it was my role, I wouldn't have been successful. Now, that's a personal view, Peter. For me, it always worked well. I found it a much more comfortable relationship in that way.
Jeff Gallop, were you on first-name terms with your head of department?
I agree totally with what Peter's said in that area. I think all relationships between professional people and their clients, academics and students, ought to be, conducted on those terms. First-name terms, I guess we all drift in that respect from time to time, but I do think it's very important for public servants to have that slight distance from the government, so when the time comes and they need to say to you, look, Minister, that's a good idea, but the law says this. You do need to have that advice given to you, and I think if things get too close, there is a risk indeed that a person may feel obliged to start diluting what would be important advice. I generally agree with Peter's point in terms of all professions. I think all professions should work on that basis. I don't know about the Ken Henry relationship with the government, so I won't comment on that. I am a little bit concerned that Ken Henry's a bit out there politically on occasions in terms of public debate. He gets egged on by the opposition and he doesn't seem to be able to resist a hit back. I'm not sure that's a good thing.
There's a trend in the media, of course, too, for journalists interviewing politicians to refer to each other by first-name terms, and it's something I've resisted. I feel a bit old-fashioned sometimes using people's full names or titles when I hear many of my colleagues talking in first-name terms. And, of course, politicians refer to journalists often in first-name terms, and I suspect there's a certain deliberateness about that. Let me pick up on another issue which has been raised and I wanted to explore a bit further, and that is that politicians and public servants are both supposed to be held to account, but they live by very different rules. People accept that politicians lie, that they deceive, that they don't tell us the whole truth. Public servants, however, are expected to tell the truth. They have, in fact, a legal responsibility not to lie or deceive. So what happens when the public servant knows that his or her minister is lying, or at least deceiving? Does that public servant, Peter Shergold, have an obligation to tell us what's going on? They know that those kids weren't thrown overboard. They know that those photographs show something different than what the minister has said.
Just on children thrown overboard, it is important to say that it was actually public servants who told the government that. So let's remember where that issue
I think there was a ministerial advisor involved as well.
But of course, look, do you say no to your minister? Do I say no, Prime Minister? In policy terms, the answer is no. I may argue very strongly that this is not a very sensible policy, that the unintended consequences haven't been thought through, etc. But at the end of the day, as a public servant, I will always say, yes, Prime Minister. But there are areas in which I would say no. Jeff's touched on a couple of them. No, I can't do that because we don't have an appropriation. No, because that breaches the law. No, because that actually breaches the parliamentary convention of what happens during a caretaker period. No, because you have delegated the responsibility for this tender process to myself. So there is often occasions where you do have to say no. But do you say expose a minister or a prime minister who is lying? The truth is, it is rarely that clear. That is the truth. It is how, the nature of politics is that you do give the best account of your policies you can. Absolutely. If I was working to a minister who I heard stand up in Parliament and say something that was wrong, yes, I would be on the phone within 30 seconds to tell the minister, this is a problem, Minister, and you better go back into Parliament to make this clear.
What happens when the minister doesn't say it in Parliament, but says it to me on the radio, and then says it again the next day, even after you've rung the minister and said, Minister, that wasn't actually correct, this is the correct. X is not Y, X is actually Z. Now, if you then come to me, ring me up, Peter, how are you? What the minister told you is actually not what he said, it should be this. Are you leaking or are you whistleblowing?
Well, leaking and whistleblowing is a very interesting thing. Governments always think public servants are leaking and oppositions always think they're whistleblowing. That's how it works. And, of course, the media always think they're doing the right thing by freeing information. In my view, there is quite a clear distinction. It is governments and politicians who are elected. Public servants are appointed for careers. Governments, when they are elected for the time in which they are in government, have the right to discern and articulate what is the national interest. And therefore, a public servant who starts to disagree with government policy and on that basis leak it to another political party or to the media is absolutely leaking. In my view, they have lost their moral compass because their role is to serve successive governments. However, if a public servant knows that a minister or another public servant, a senior public servant, has broken the law, has behaved unethically, then yes, they are absolutely and should be encouraged to blow the whistle.
Actually, under the Corruption Commission laws in the 3 states I mentioned, they're legally obliged to. And that is a big difference from the Commonwealth.
But Jeff Gallop, if I can get your comments here, there's a difference then between blowing the whistle on corruption or unethical behaviour and calling the bluff on the lie or the dissembling in public.
I think you were wrong in your assumption that public servants and politicians are subject to different laws in that area. I think the law is quite clear. Obviously, both are subject to the same legal sanctions in respect of that issue, both public servants and politicians. And I think the distinction you drew was really a distinction between, the art of politics and the deviousness that's involved and all that type of thing. But in terms of the law, I don't think there is a difference. Certainly in terms of the codes of conduct that exist that cover ministerial, cover the work of ministers, that cover the work of ministerial officers, they're very, very similar in that respect. So I don't think there is a legal difference.
I'd argue there is a legal difference, Jeff, in the sense that...
there may be at the Commonwealth level, but certainly not at those 3 states I refer to.
And indeed, my knowledge is obviously more Commonwealth-based, but the fact that you have a code of conduct that is, arguably not enforceable, or, it's not, it doesn't have a statutory application, as opposed to the laws under which public servants operate. And I think, Peter, you were being perhaps a touch tough with Peter there about putting the onus on public servants to, necessarily expose unethical, say, behaviour of governments or ministers. Obviously, we need to make sure that public servants are in a position where they can operate according to the law, according to the Act under which they are employed, also that they can feel that they can offer frank and fearless advice without sort of some punitive response from their minister. But what about looking at the other side of the equation? Why not beefing up laws or code of conduct or truth in political advertising or whatever it may be to ensure that politicians generally and Prime Ministers specifically are not in a position where they can get away with any form of certainly corrupt behaviour, but of course anything that is lies or unethical behaviour. And I still think, I know everyone here says, but of course politicians are going to do whatever it takes or not tell the truth. There are still constraints that we could as a society, and parliaments could, and specifically at a Commonwealth level, that we could implement to ensure that there were some more safeguards.
And Alex Wadek, as you suggested, a stronger question time might be one of them.
Yes, we've just had in the last few days the death of Robert McNamara in the United States, and reminded me of the Pentagon Papers, which Robert McNamara had initiated, and they were the history of US involvement in Vietnam. And it was an objective history, and the Nixon administration went to elaborate attempts to keep that from emerging. I think what's remarkable about that was that all the people who were interviewed as part of that project were all of the view that the US had been wrong to initiate involvement in that war, and that the war was unwinnable. They were all of that view. And so here was the truth. And what the US government was trying to stop was the truth emerging out into the public. It was extraordinary development. And I think this really lies at the heart of this problem, that we somehow have to get better at documenting what's going on and getting that kind of information out into the public in a more timely fashion.
Well, as a journalist, someone who works in the media, of course, I would argue for a much stronger freedom of information regime, one in which the presumption was, and in fact Senator John Faulkner, when he was Special Minister of State, was arguing for this, the presumption is that a document is public unless it fits into a specific set of categories. That is, it's a cabinet briefing paper, it relates to national security, personal, individual details, things like that. So, Peter Shergold, as someone who's been at the heart of government, would you like to see a much stronger disclosure regime?
I would like to see a clearer disclosure regime. I think what I would want to see... as a public servant, I work under the FOI legislation that Parliament has decided on. And those are the constraints in which I operate. Now, would I like to see a stronger FOI legislation? Yes, I think I would, but also clearer. And I think, rather like you, I would relate it to cabinet papers, but I would probably have a broader definition than you. That is to say, I don't think it's just the cabinet submission going forward. I still believe it is useful to protect the confidentiality of the advice that goes to ministers in the advice they're going to take forward to cabinet. That is to say, the advice I'm giving on a range of options, should you do this or not do this, the media are always interested, well, did government take your advice? Now, my view is our Westminster system can only work where that is actually protected from scrutiny.
But why? Because, I mean, why not say, well, the minister was given 5 options and these were spelled out as the advantages and the disadvantages in each case, and the minister opted for option C, which happened to be the most politically popular. But why not let us see that process? What's to be feared?
What is to be feared is the strength of the policy advice that will go to ministers. Let me be honest with you. I will write and construct things differently if I think it's going to become a public document. I will give oral briefing instead of written briefing in certain circumstances in that way. I think it is appropriate, just like the private sector or indeed the community sector would expect some confidentiality around their board proceedings. I think governments need the same. They need some protection. Now, I think that is still a much more limited range of documents than are presently protected by FOI. FOI, I think, works pretty well at the Commonwealth level in terms of individuals trying to find out the decisions that have been made about them. That's where it works
Your
well.
own case
It
file.
doesn't work well for you in the media wanting to get behind the policy decision that was taken.
Peter, surely this is a balanced question. No one would doubt that there's a very important role for confidentiality to be respected in the way that you've outlined. But on the other hand, there are real benefits for greater transparency. And I think the position that most people in the community have, most people, of course, in the media would have, is that the balance has shifted far too far towards protecting confidentiality and not far enough towards allowing for a greater transparency and accountability.
But Alex or Peter, just imagine, for example, this is a purely hypothetical example, but imagine that it had been, people had access to the policy advice that I gave to the Prime Minister in confidence on whether the Prime Minister and the government should say sorry or not. Now, imagine the use that the media would have made of that if it was, in fact, different from what the government had actually decided on.
Well,
I'm just wondering, what is so bad about that? Once again, we're getting back to this incredible influence of the media in determining an agenda.
Increasingly, you would get, well, Premier, why did you disagree with the advice to you given by Treasury? It would have eroded any trust between myself and the Prime Minister I served to be caught up in a media debate about why you, Prime Minister, may or may not have rejected the advice that was given by the Secretary of the Department.